Welcome to the Groove Pod, where two cousins and lovers of music explore their journeys through audio and listening to music, and specifically explore whether or not it's worth going down the path of vinyl in this digital age. Thanks for joining us, and we hope you enjoy the show. All right, welcome to another episode of the Groove Pod. It took me a second to remember what we were called then. When we last stopped off, we need to say apologies to those that were eagerly awaiting the third episode 2 weeks ago. Both Nick and I have been sick, and so we thought rather than coughing and spluttering, or in Nick's case, just laying quietly in a bed, fevering and shivering, we thought we would just bypass that one, and so we're here with episode 3, but a fortnight late. So apologies to everyone for that one. And let's kick straight into it. So Nick, you had some homework, which despite having been sick, you have had time to do, I believe. Let's get probably the quicker conversation out of the way, which was vinyl weight. We talked in the second episode about how I'd gone out and bought these records. I had no idea what it meant in terms of quality that I was getting. I think it was 180 gram vinyl or something like that. And you had some understanding, but you were going to go away and look at some more about it and give us some information. So where did you land?
Well, hi, Locke. Yes, and sorry for happy birthday.
Thank you.
Happy belated birthday. So the TLDR here is that maybe like everything, there's a rabbit hole here that we can go down on vinyl weights. And I thought that, maybe naively thought that it would be a relatively sort of light and simple topic. And I guess in some ways it is, but in other ways it is a complete rabbit hole. So I'm, again, not an expert. I've just been reading through some Wikipedia articles and looking at some of the vinyl subreddits and asking lots of ChatGPT questions. And so basically the weight of the amount of vinyl used, the puck of vinyl resin that gets put onto the platter and is squashed down to make the vinyl record, used to be somewhere around about sort of 120 to 140 grams as the average. And at some point, it was sort of determined that if you, basically use a little bit more vinyl resin, 150 grams, 160 grams, and now there's a category they called heavyweight, 180 to 200 grams, that you can essentially get a better quality or a longer lasting audiophile quality or audiophile sort of version of that record. And so it's thought that it would be less prone to warping, that the stylus will stay in the groove better than in a lighter weight or a lesser weight amount of vinyl. And there are people that certainly claim that you can even hear the sort of difference in the sound quality depending on obviously the equipment that you're using. So a very general rule of thumb is that a cheaper vinyl pressing, a cheaper, more mass market edition is going to be on that lower end, somewhere around about 120 grams. And then once you get above sort of 150, 160 and pushing 180, that's now considered a sort of an audiophile quality where it's going to hopefully last longer, less prone to warping, and potentially going to be able to either include some more fidelity in the of the information in the grooves, and also perhaps allow for the stylus to sit in that groove more snugly and more with more sort of integrity, I guess. And so overall, it's sort of considered, going to be a better experience. So that's where I'm at right now. That's been me reading, as I said, Wikipedia articles, a little bit of Reddit, a little bit of other sort of vinyl head, blogs and stuff. Maybe some of that's wrong. I'd love to learn if I've misinterpreted some of that. But that's sort of the general. That's my sort of general TLDR on vinyl weights. The other thing that I think I mentioned very briefly was vinyl quality. And what is really interesting is that, like I was born in 81, I think you were born in 79.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if you and I experienced this or can sort of remember this, but there was an oil shortage in, I think, the early 70s, and I don't know how long that went, and then how that sort of impacted Australia and what the long tail of that was. During this sort of oil crisis, and this sort of oil shortage that was happening in that time. And I should have looked up the dates, but it's somewhere, I'm going to say somewhere around about the 70s. The record manufacturers couldn't get basically their hands on oil to create enough brand new sort of virgin vinyl PVC or whatever the actual sort of raw material is. And so they started to recycle PVC. They started to recycle vinyl material. And so there is a period of time in which recycled or partially recycled vinyl material was used to create new vinyl records. And it's sort of since been determined that a lot of those are pretty crap. I don't know if you can never recycle vinyl at all, or perhaps just in the 70s when this was sort of happening, maybe the chemistry wasn't there, maybe the manufacturing wasn't there, or maybe just sort of the sort of quality of the mass, consumer audio equipment wasn't at a high enough fidelity that people could really tell, but certainly they can now. And so when you look at older pressings that you're buying on Discogs or at a flea market or secondhand, if they're coming from that sort of 70s era, I think, again, I probably should have looked up the dates and we can maybe put that in show notes, but there's a chance that if that sort of pressing was during this sort of oil crisis, that partial or even entirely recycled vinyl might have been used to make that record. And then if sort of care wasn't taken in that process, those records can be considered pretty ordinary in terms of sound quality, if not even just sort of structural integrity.
Wow.
And so that's fascinating, right? Yeah. I would never have known about that. And that's sort of one of the little rabbit holes I started reading about. And now I want to know more about that. And I've got some records that I've bought secondhand from the 70s. And now I want to know, were they, pressed on high quality new, I think they literally call it virgin vinyl or virgin PVC, or was it partially recycled or fully recycled, and would I be able to tell? So a whole new avenue for me to go and explore. But that's what I've learned in the last few days of not having, being not underneath a blanket, sweating from the flu. That's my little quick update on vinyl weights and vinyl quality.
That's really interesting. It just reinforces what we've been saying for the last couple of episodes, where there's so much, and this is a double-edged sword, because I think it makes the hobby a fascinating place to dive into if you have the time and the interest to do so, because there's so much to discover, there's so many different things to experiment with. But at the same time, for somebody like me, it's exactly the thing that stops me from getting into vinyl. So I think that's kind of interesting, cool, and a little bit disappointing all at the same time.
And then there's the debate about coloured vinyl and vinyl picture discs, right? So in order to put colour into the either have a single coloured vinyl disc that isn't that sort of that black that we all think of when we think of a vinyl record, or even a picture disc which actually has a printed picture embedded or underneath. There are a lot of trade-offs that can happen, and there are people that will tell you that no, if your goal is the highest quality reproduction of the sound on the vinyl medium, you don't want colored vinyl, or you don't want vinyl with specks and flashes of colors through it, or a picture disc underneath it. Those are very much sort of gimmick things that you might want for for fun and for collecting, but not actually for sound reproduction. Again, I'm not at the point where I can listen to, I don't have two releases of a single record on different mediums, whether it's colored and uncolored or picture disc or not, to compare. So that's another thing for me to go and investigate at some point in the future.
And the same thing with going back to the vinyl weights is that unless you can find two otherwise identical pressings, so having used the same master, the same press, like all that stuff, with just the weight of the vinyl being the only difference, unless you can isolate it to that, there's no way of knowing if it's the weight that's making the difference or if it's the master or the press, the plate, whatever. So it's very challenging, and it reminds me in the headphone world, there's been an ongoing debate that drives me a bit nuts, because people talk about how headphone X, particularly some of the more apparently, I say apparently in the sense that some people think that certain headphones are much harder to drive than they really are. And there's this big thing that, it sounds better on headphone amp X than it does on headphone amp Y, and headphone amp X has more power, therefore this headphone needs more power to sound its best. And it's like, well, no, because you've got two different amps. If you've got two different amps, they're not the same sounding amp to start with, and so you can't isolate the variable of power because it could also be that one's got different capacitors and resistors in it that is why it sounds better, and it just happens to have more power. Just like with the vinyl weight thing, it might be that the heavier one sounds better, but is that because it happened to come from a better master, or it happened to be made on a better quality press, or whatever the other variables might be? So it gets so tricky to kind of tease out what's really at the root of the differences in sound sometimes.
And so in your world, in your Passion for Sound project, have you gone to the trouble of setting up some sort of A/B test where 98% or 99% of the equipment and the signal chain and all of that is identical, and you're just testing one very, very small subcomponent? So, for example, have you bought two of the same manufacturer and of a headphone amp, but one is rated at 15 watts and the other one is rated at 30 watts? I'm sort of making it up now, but have you had an experience where you've been able to sort of do that truly isolated A/B test?
Not the nearest thing where that's possible is when you get to things like op amps, which are the little chips that go inside amplifiers and digital to analog converters, or DACs as well, and they kind of do the final stage of providing the current to output the signal to whatever's downstream. So it might be a headphone, it might be a speaker, it might be from a DAC going out to an amplifier. And so there are some of these devices on the market where you can swap these op amp chips.
OP amp? OP?
So OP-AMP, and it stands for operational amplifier.
Okay.
Every single amp
Is that what
has...
would a MOSFET chip? Is that an op amp? I'm not testing you. You hear of MOSFET all the time, and I'm wondering, is that an op amp?
The MOSFET is the transistor, and the transistor would be a part of the op amp circuit. So, and this is where op amps get really confusing, because op amp can be a discrete circuit. In other words, all individual components on a board. A designer might look at an amplifier and go, well, that section's the power supply, and that section's the op amp, and that section's the something else. So an op amp can be anything from a section of a circuit board that does the amplification piece, or it can be an integrated chip, like a little silicon chip with 8 pins sticking out of it. Or some of the others, the ones that I like to use, they look like a little plug-in chip, but on the inside there's actually individual tiny circuit boards. And so they're what they call a discrete op amp, where it's that discrete board layout that I mentioned first has been kind of miniaturized and stuck inside a thing that can just plug in and plug out. And so a MOSFET would be part of that. What's interesting though is when you're able to take identical products and plug in different op amp chips, you start to learn that alone can change the sound of an amp. And that's just one part of an amplifier, is the op amp chip. So changing the power supply can help it, changing the op amp can help it. And are there any other meaningful parts? In an amplifier, there's probably not a lot of other meaningful parts. In some of the Class D speaker amps around now, they use different brands of speaker amplification chip, and those chips sound different. So I'm finding with all my reviews that there's two major brands. There's Texas Instruments make a chip, and Infineon is a German brand that make a chip or chips. And essentially they're the same thing. They're both doing the same process of Class D amplification, but they sound very different. And I'm consistently finding that when I hear an Infineon-based amp, it sounds better than a Texas Instruments-based amp. And this is where it gets so interesting, is when you can actually get two equivalent products side by side, where really you've only got one or two tiny variables. That's where you start to get understanding. But when we start comparing apples and oranges, because you've got amplifier X over there, which has got a different circuit layout, a different power output, a different set of op amps, to amplifier, I don't know what nomenclature I started with, but a different amplifier with different settings and stuff, it's very difficult to say, well, this sounds better because of this, because there's too many variables going on. And
right, so you can subjectively say, I like this better, yes, but then to be able to pinpoint exactly what is resulting in you enjoying that better or thinking that's better is very challenging, if not difficult,
exactly,
if not impossible.
Like I couldn't sit here. I've got two really stellar headphone amps here in front of me. There's the Version Audio Voyager headphone amp and the Enlium Amp 23. Both of them are incredibly good, and I love both for different reasons. I couldn't tell you why they sound... I mean, I can tell you the things that are different, which would all contribute to them sounding different, but I couldn't sit here and say, oh, well, the Enlium sounds the way it does because it's got a different power supply setup. Because it's more than that. It's the power supply setup. It's the fact that it doesn't use what's called global feedback. It's the fact that it uses a MOSFET design. it's got 3 different things, and that's without me even knowing the technical ins and outs. I know it has 3 things that are very different from the Burson, but there could be more. And that's where it gets so complicated to understand.
Okay. All right.
We've just gone off on a way different tangent than where we started, but hopefully it was interesting.
No, it was very interesting. And I think that's, I'm thinking about, okay, so my humble setup that I have here at home that I'm listening on, I've been trying to think of like, well, what are some inexpensive, maybe not necessarily inexpensive, but I mean, I'd like them to be inexpensive. What are some things that I could try to sort of A/B test my equipment and see what's going to be better? And I'll talk about switching from phono to aux in just a sec. But, one thing I was thinking of was I have not yet upgraded the stylus in my record player, and that's something that I want to do. And so that's, like to talk to you about that, Locke, in terms of, where you think I should be sort of investigating, and if not investing in 1 or 2 styluses and then being able to sort of A/B test them in the system. I don't think that I have enough. I don't think that I could tell the difference if I were to change out the speaker cabling. I know there's a lot of people who invest in that and feel very passionately about that, and I'm sure that there are differences to be heard and to be enjoyed. I just don't know if I've had enough experience to be able to do that, but it is something I could test. I could definitely get some different speaker cable and try different things there. There's sort of the 2 that come to mind, stylus and maybe speaker cabling. I think speaker cabling probably isn't where I would see sort of any incremental change, if anything. I think stylus is probably where I should maybe first think about testing out some new parts, but I don't know. Have you had any thoughts about that? I know I sort of shared my equipment with you. While you've sat with that, has anything sort of come to mind?
I think the biggest things I'd say is that there is no doubt for me that components and the upgrades of those components, changing a stylus whilst it looks like a small piece, is a very significant part of a component. So component upgrades will always net better benefits than things like cables, without a doubt. I'm a huge fan of cables, much to the dismay of many people on YouTube. I'm a big fan of upgrading cables. I think it makes a big difference for what it is. And what I mean there is that, as I said...
Oh, and I may have said cable and I meant wire. What I was referring to, sorry, was you was the same thing. Okay, sorry. What I was referring to is the black and red plugs coming out of my amp receiver thing that then connects to the speaker itself. It's the speaker wire. Yeah. That's what I was thinking. Like going from 16 AWG to 12 AWG or whatever. Like that's what I was talking about when I mean that. But sorry, keep going.
No, that's okay. So when I'm saying cable, it could be anything from, and bear with me, it could be anything from power cables, USB cables, Ethernet cables, speaker cables, the RCA and the XLR cables. Any of those are all bundled into that same category of cables. They can all make a difference. And I'm still, to be honest, very uncertain as to which cables I think make the most difference, if any. Once upon a time, I would have said like analog cables, speaker cables, and RCA cables make the most difference. And then I've played with power cables, and I've played with USB cables that have made me go, oh, hang on, maybe these have more impact. So I completely have no view as to which one makes the most difference or which type makes the most difference. So I would always recommend that somebody looks at components first if they're looking for the biggest step up. But there's a really interesting caveat here. There will come a point at which the cable becomes your bottleneck. And so you could make a component change and go, nah, that didn't do so much. But what's actually happening is the component's at a level now that's beyond the transparency, let's call it, of the cables. And so you're just not hearing what it does. And a great example of that, I'll give you 2 really interesting examples I've had recently. I tried the world's best cable, speaker cables. It's a brand on Amazon.
I was going to say, is that a brand or like that's a bold claim, sir?
Yeah.
Okay.
And they used to make the cables out of well-known wires like Canare, Megami, the cable companies that also supply like recording studios. So it's professional grade cable.
Yep.
And so I bought a set of that thinking this will be interesting. I'll see how it compares to other cables. And I did a review of the Weem Ultra? No. The Weem amp, it's called. So Weem make an all-in-one streamer and speaker amp. And I tested that. I've set it up in the living room, and I had the Weem amp, a nice set of speakers made by Monitor Audio, which is a British speaker company. They were just the cheaper speakers, but still a nice speaker. And I connected them up with the world's best cables. And I listened and I was like, yeah, it's all right. It's not great. And so I had a bit of general listening time and it sounded fine. And it was good for kind of what I would call living music. Like when you just put music on and you get about your life.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm going a step above background
Sort of
music.
Right.
It's at the level that you're able to listen and enjoy, but you're not
Well, I was
sitting
going
and
to say
focusing.
background, but maybe you don't. So not background. So background is where it's just there. It's more like it's colorful white noise, but
Yes.
you're not saying that. You're saying it's happening around you. You're actively enjoying it, but you're not sitting in one place and focusing all your attention on consuming the entertainment of the music.
Exactly.
Got
So
it.
it's the step below critical listening, but
Right.
when you're
Critical
still,
listening, I love it.
but when you're still kind of paying attention to the music
Yep.
and enjoying the music for its sake. And so I finished up with that, and I brought the same setup, exactly the same setup, into my office, and where I had other gear that I wanted to compare it to. And so for the comparison, I used my high quality speaker cables that I had in my system.
Now,
And
hang
all of
on.
a sudden,
That's the brand. The brand is called High Quality,
no,
or you just mean like.
I actually can't remember what brand it was.
Oh,
So
got it. You
whatever
just
it
mean
was,
that you used a different type
a
of speaker
better
cable,
quality of
a
cable,
better
like
quality, right?
I say better quality in the sense that it's higher priced. It's meant to be better. And I plugged it all
Even though
in.
the other
And
ones are the world's best cables.
well, I'll come back to that in a second.
Okay, all right. So you did higher quality cables in your office.
Correct. And so
Okay.
I plugged it all in using what I was used to having in my office, and the system came to life. And all of a sudden, this Weem amp went from me thinking it was just okay to, I think in the review, saying I think it's absolutely brilliant because it's this perfect all-in-one box where you're not really sacrificing for the price you're paying. You're not sacrificing sound quality to get a brilliant unit. It's a streamer, it's an amplifier, and it does everything you need it to do in a single box for a few $100 US. And that was quite revealing for me, was that my opinions on the product changed so much, and the only thing that shifted was, other than the room, but accounting for the fact that every room sounds different, the sheer performance of the system transformed with the different cables. And that's what I mean about sometimes the cables can be the bottleneck once you get to a certain point. And sometimes, as that example shows, the point can be quite low because that's not a crazy high-end system we're talking about. It was $300 or $400 bookshelf speakers and a $300 or $400 streaming amplifier. And so actually maybe I'm underselling the speakers. They might be $500 for the pair US. I don't recall exactly, but they were the Monitor Audio Bronze 50s. So that's one example. And then the other thing that happened recently was I had, and this is where we come back to what I said before about who's to say what's better and worse, and it all gets very complicated. I've got a new pair of speakers here at the moment, which are a lovely pair of British-made ProAC speakers, and I hooked them up in my office. I've been using a different set of world's best cables, so they make different grades, and their top-level grade is an amazing speaker cable, and it's not crazy expensive. I think it's $150 a meter, which sounds like a lot until you realize you can spend thousands of dollars a meter.
Yeah.
And I haven't tried those speaker cable levels, and I'm reluctant to. But I hooked up these new ProAcs with the world's best cables, and I was a bit kind of disappointed in the ProAcs. And before I decided to get rid of them, I don't even know why I did this, but I swapped over the speaker cables to a different set I had. And they're an equivalently kind of priced and performing cable from a different brand. And that other set of cables, which was a tellurium cable, the brand is Tellurium, they worked perfectly with the ProAcs and just brought the whole system to life in a different way. And that, like, those two examples for me is where I wasn't even thinking about the cables. I wasn't focused on the cables, but it completely changed my experience of the products that I was focused on. And so that's
and in
where I
that
think
example,
cables
were you
matter.
saying that one set of cables brought a system to life
Mhm.
in a wonderful way, but that exact same set of cables sort of underperformed in a different sort of
No,
set of
sorry.
equipment?
Sorry, I've made it unclear because I had two different cables made by the same company. So the first example was the base level world's best cable.
Yep.
The second example was starting off with what they call the world's best cable Pro Quad cables, I think they're called.
Okay.
And those are a wonderful, wonderful cable, which I would recommend for most systems. It just happened that there was a certain synergy between the Tellurium cables and the ProAC speakers that was not there with the world's best cables, the premium world's best cables. But I prefer the premium world's best cables with my other Harbath speakers, which I'd been using previously. So this is where it gets really messy and confusing.
My gosh, wow. It's fascinating to hear you speak about that. It's also confusing.
Yes.
And it's also a little demoralizing a little bit.
I think if you listen carefully, you can hear all the people clicking off the podcast going, "This is too hard. I'm out."
Well, let's maybe we should table that. Not people turning off the episode. No, what I mean is, so it feels like what you're saying is that there's some sort of there is a subjective, obviously it's all subjective, but it also feels like you're in a unique position, or I assume you are in a unique position in that you have access to different types of not just components, but the cables that connect them together, that you can test things out and actually see that, wow, these two relatively high end or similarly priced high quality products, which are good quality and will bring systems to life in certain scenarios, don't, when you change those mixtures of components up, they actually don't bring it to life in the same way. And so there's obviously things going on there that are very, very difficult potentially to measure. And, part of me is thinking like, and I'm not a physicist or electrical engineer, but I'm like, gosh, I wonder if there's, subtle differences in the amount of resistance that might be happening in the output voltage of one thing, and then how that, how much voltage loss or not there is, and then how the other system compensates for it, and, blah, 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 blah. And I just kept, part of me is thinking like, how would you ever know without being able to just sort of try a bunch of things and see what you like best?
And I think that's important for us to answer that, so that people know and so that people don't feel demoralized with this, because it can be absolutely overwhelming. The first thing I'll say, without going into the details of it, is it all comes down to the physics of the cables. So every cable is a combination of its resistance, its capacitance, and its inductance. So resistance is how hard it is to push the signal through it. Inductance, okay, what's inductance?
That's when you deputize a goose.
I can't think of how to explain inductance. So I know capacitance is the tendency of the cable to want to hold onto the signal. Like a capacitor, which is kind of like a battery.
Yep.
So they want to hold onto the signal. Inductance is to do with, from memory, the generation of an electrical signal, but I can't remember how that works. So yes, sorry, I can't think of how to explain it, and I didn't want to get into the depths anyway. The thing that I've taken away from all the research I've done is that the one that's actually really having the most impact is capacitance, because any decent cable should have fairly low resistance, unless it's meant to be some digital cables have to have a resistance of, say, 75 ohms. But for, say, speaker cables, you want a low resistance cable. You don't want the cable to be acting as a resistor and filtering the sound. And so capacitance seems to be the one that really matters. But where it gets really tricky for cable designers is that you can't change one without changing the others. It's like a three-way seesaw. And so it's not a case of just saying, well, we'll make capacitance 0 and then we've got the perfect cable, because if capacitance is 0, inductance and resistance will have done other things to compensate for that. So that's where it gets really messy, and that's why it does get really tricky. And the reason you want capacitance really low, in very simple terms, is that you want the signal to get through that cable as quickly as possible without the cable holding onto any parts of that signal for longer than it should. And capacitance can interact differently at different frequencies. So you don't want a cable that sends everything other than 5 kilohertz and above through instantly, but holds back the 5 kilohertz and above for a couple of milliseconds, because our ears will hear that as a mismatch in the sound. And that's a really, really bad example, but just in broad strokes. So what it means for people and why people shouldn't get demoralized is that if you do look at reviews of cables, when you're thinking about choosing cables, anyone who's reviewing the cables with an open mind, that's doing listening and describing what they hear, as opposed to those that just go, I measured the frequency response, I can't see a difference, therefore they do nothing. Anyone who's describing what they're hearing is going to describe things like, it's got more attack here, it's got a more solid bass. They'll describe the sound. And what I've found is that most of the time, if you've got a system and you think, I want to upgrade my speaker cables, but I don't want my system to get brighter than it currently is, it's already just on the edge, and maybe if anything I want it a bit smoother, that's how you go and choose your speaker cable or your RCA cable or your XLR cable, is you find someone who's described the cables that says, this one's a bit smoother than this one, it creates a more sense of space. You go, okay, I want a smoother cable, I'm going to go towards that one. Or I want a brighter, more crisp and clean and resolving sounding system, I'm going to go for the one that's been described as being a bit brighter, crisper and more detailed.
Or you could be in my situation where the RCA cable is physically built in to the record player and there's nothing I can do about it, which breaks my brain. But brings me to my homework. Here we are, like 30 minutes into the episode, and God bless anyone that's still with us after half an hour.
And before you get rolling, Nick, I'm thinking we should actually hold this over, teaser
Oh my gosh.
and
Okay.
make it the next episode. What do you think?
Good with me.
Okay, so hopefully this episode was interesting for those that were curious about the rabbit hole of vinyl weight and cables. You're obviously quickly learning if you're listening to this that we go where the topic takes us. So we're gonna end this episode here, and in the next episode, which Nic and I are going to record right now, so you know it's going to happen a fortnight from now, it's going to get released, we will talk about a couple of things. We've got Nic's experience with the phono versus the auxiliary input, so basically using the internal phono preamp of his turntable or bypassing it. I've got a similar story from my experience with the FIO TT13 turntable, similar but different story, but all relating to phono preamps. And we've got some new music to talk about as well in the next episode. So we hope you've enjoyed this one, and we hope we'll see you, or you'll hear us, and we'll get to chat on the next one in a fortnight's time. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Groove Pod. Until next time, happy listening, and we hope you'll join us again.